The morning fog clung to the hedgerows of Normandy like a wet blanket, thick enough to taste. It was July 1944, and the bocage country of northern France had become a nightmare maze of ancient stone walls, sunken roads, and impenetrable vegetation that turned every field into a potential killing ground. Somewhere in that labyrinth, a column of American Sherman tanks rolled forward with the grinding confidence of steel that had crossed an ocean to be here. The German commanders watching from concealed positions allowed themselves thin smiles. They had seen this before. The Shermans were coming, and the Shermans would burn. For 2 years, German tank doctrine had been built on a foundation of cold mathematics and brutal field experience. Their newest predator, the Panther tank, mounted a 75mm KWK-42 gun that could punch through a Sherman-S frontal armor from over a mile away. The Tiger, even more fearsome, carried an 88mm cannon that treated Allied armor like tinfoil. German tankers had learned to wait, to let the Americans come close, to pick their moment with surgical precision. The kill ratio spoke for itself. In most engagements, it took 5 Shermans to guarantee the destruction of a single German heavy tank, 5 American crews, 5 steel coffins that would cook their occupants alive when the ammunition stored inside ignited in what tankers grimly called brewing up. The Germans had a name for the Sherman that said everything about their contempt: Tommy Cocker, the Tommy Cooker, a kitchen appliance for roasting British and American soldiers. The German High Command had distributed technical bulletins analyzing the Sherman's weaknesses with clinical detachment. Thin armor, maximum 76mm at best on upgraded models, often just 51mm on the standard M4, a high profile that made it visible from ridiculous distances, a gasoline engine that transformed into a fireball at the first penetrating hit, and perhaps most damningly, a 75mm main gun that simply lacked the penetrating power to threaten German heavy armor at anything but point-blank range. The tactical psychology was clear. American tank crews would panic. They had to where they were driving mobile crematoriums into battle against superior firepower, and they knew it. The Germans had watched it happen in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. That moment when the radio chatter became frantic, when the columns scattered, when crew discipline shattered like the armor plate under their guns. The Americans were brave. The Germans acknowledged. But bravery meant nothing when your weapon could unhurt the enemy and his weapon could kill you from the next apartment. German defensive doctrine in Normandy had evolved into something beautifully cruel. Let the Shermans advance into the bocage. Let them navigate the narrow lanes where their numbers meant nothing. Position the Panthers and Tigers in hold-down positions where only their turrets showed, their frontal armor angled to deflect incoming rounds. Wait until the Shermans were committed, until retreat would mean exposing their thinner side and rear armor, then open fire. The first shot would be catastrophic. The second would be unnecessary. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't know because it contradicted everything their experience had taught them, was that American tank doctrine had undergone a quiet revolution. The crews rolling through those hedgerows in July 1944 were the same tankers who had landed in North Africa 2 years earlier. They were veterans now, survivors of a dozen engagements, and they had learned lessons written in the burned wreckage of their predecessors. The American tank schools had changed. Training now emphasized not individual heroics but collective response. Platoon tactics had been refined through after-action reports written in blood. Most critically, the radio discipline that had once been merely adequate had become exceptional. Every tank commander could communicate instantly with his entire platoon. Every gunner had been drilled endlessly on target acquisition speed. Every driver knew the evasive maneuvers by instinct, and they had learned to hunt. The German ambush unfolded exactly as planned. A Panther, concealed in a thicket at the end of a sunken lane, waited until the lead Sherman was at 400 meters. The range was almost insulting, a guaranteed kill. The Panther's commander gave the order, and the 75mm KWK-42 spoke with authority. The round struck the lead Sherman on the frontal glacis plate at a slight angle, exactly where the armor was thinnest. The physics were inexorable. The solid shot, traveling at nearly 1,000 meters per second, punched through the steel plate, spalling fragments of superheated metal into the crew compartment. The driver died instantly. The bow gunner was ripped apart by the shrapnel. Inside the turret, the commander felt the impact like a hammer blow against his skull, even though the round had penetrated there. This was the moment. This was where the column should panic. Instead, the lead Sherman's commander, a 23-year-old lieutenant from Ohio named William Henderson, did something the Germans hadn't anticipated. His voice came over the radio, steady and precise, even as smoke began filling his crew compartment. Contact, front. Panther in the tree line. 400 meters, I'm hit. 2-6 swing right and flank. 3-2 put smoke on my position. 4-1 you've got the shot. 19 seconds. That's how long it took for the American response to transform from ambush to counter-ambush. 19 seconds that rewrote German assumptions about American fighting spirit. Sherman 2-6, commanded by Sergeant Michael Torres, gunned his engine and crashed through the hedgerow on the right. Branches scraping against armor, his gunner already traversing the turret toward where the Panther had to be. The Sherman's suspension absorbed the impact as it burst into the adjacent field. and Torres was already calling corrections to his gunner. Sherman 3-2 fired smoke rounds that erupted in chemical clouds, obscuring the German line of sight. The Panther commander, suddenly blind, began backing his tank deeper into cover. But movement meant noise, and the Americans had localized him. Sherman 4-1, the platoon's sole M4A3E8 variant with the upgraded 76mm gun, had been trailing the column. Its commander, a taciturn Texan named Robert Kincaid, had already identified the most likely ambush positions before the first shot was fired. When Henderson's call came, Kincaid's gunner, a former duck hunter from Louisiana named James Broussard, was already acquiring the target. Through his gun sight, Broussard could see the Panther's turret protruding from the foliage, the long gun barrel pulling back as the German tank tried to reposition. The smoke was spreading, but he had maybe 3 seconds before the target disappeared completely. "Identified," Broussard said, his voice flat with concentration. "Fire," Kincaid ordered. The 76mm gun recoiled, and the armor-piercing round crossed 400 meters in less than half a second. It struck the Panther's turret ring, that vulnerable joint where the rotating turret met the hull, where the armor was necessarily thinner to allow movement. The penetration was clean. The round entered the fighting compartment, ricocheted off the gun breech, and detonated the ready ammunition stored near the loader's position. The Panther's turret lifted 3 feet off its mounting in a gout of flame and smoke. But that was just the opening move. Torres had reached the Panther's flank. But he'd also spotted what the Germans had really prepared: a second Panther, hull down behind a stone wall 200 meters beyond the first. The Germans had planned a double ambush, letting the Shermans fixate on the first tank while the second delivered the killing blows. "Second Panther, bearing 045, 200 meters, Torres shouted into the radio. The second Panther fired, and the round screamed past Torres's turret close enough that he felt the displacement of air. The German gunner had rushed the shot, thrown off by the sudden destruction of his companion tank and the appearance of Sherman's where none should have been. Now Torres's gunner, a baby-faced corporal from Michigan named Eddie Kowalski, had the angle. The Panther's side armor was exposed, only 40mm thick compared to the 80mm of frontal protection. At this range, even the standard 75mm Sherman gun could penetrate. On target. Fire. Kowalski put 3 rounds into the Panther's side in rapid succession. The first penetrated the engine compartment, setting the gasoline on fire. The second struck the ammunition storage. The third was unnecessary. The Panther's crew bailed out as flames engulfed their vehicle. The vaunted tank transformed into a pyre. 19 seconds had elapsed since the first shot. 2 Panthers destroyed. 0 American tanks lost, though Henderson's crew was abandoning their damaged vehicle through the escape hatches, dragging their wounded with them. But the engagement wasn't over. The remaining 3 Shermans in the platoon had spread out in a defensive arc, each tank covering different approaches, their commanders maintaining constant radio contact. This was the new American doctrine in action: dispersed positioning, mutual support, aggressive maneuver, and most critically the refusal to freeze under fire. German doctrine hadn't prepared for this. The tactical manuals assumed that destroying the lead tank would create chaos, that American crews would button up and become defensive, that their inferior armor and guns would make them cautious. Instead, the Americans had become more aggressive, using their numerical advantage and superior coordination to negate German technical superiority. A third German tank, a Panzer for that, had been held in reserve, attempted to engage from a concealed position 600 meters away. Its commander had watched the Panthers die and recognized that he was facing something different than expected. His first shot missed, and before he could fire again, 3 Shermans had identified his position and were maneuvering. The Panzer IV's commander made the rational decision and withdrew, engine screaming as he reversed up a farm road. The Americans didn't pursue. They had learned that lesson too, the hard way. The boucage was endless, and every advance could trigger another ambush. Instead, they consolidated their position, established security, and called for infantry support. Henderson's crew was extracted, the wounded treated, and a recovery vehicle was summoned for the damaged Sherman. The entire engagement, from first shot to German withdrawal, had lasted 4 minutes. Word of the engagement spread through both armies with the speed of rumor and the weight of revelation. For the Americans, it confirmed what their training and experience had been building toward. They could win, even against superior equipment, through superior tactics and crew coordination. For the Germans, it represented a disturbing evolution in their enemy. The German after-action reports filed in the following weeks revealed a grudging respect mixed with genuine concern. American tank crews no longer displayed the panic response previously observed. One report noted with clinical precision, radio discipline remains intact under fire. Flanking maneuvers are executed with increasing sophistication. The Americans are learning to fight their tanks as a team rather than as individual vehicles. What had changed? Everything and nothing. The Sherman was still the Sherman, with all its technical limitations. It was still thinly armored, still prone to catching fire, still outgunned by German heavy tanks in a straight fight. But the crews had evolved past the machine's limitations. The training pipeline back in the United States had been refined based on brutal field experience. New crews now spent weeks practicing coordinated maneuvers, learning to communicate under stress, drilling on target acquisition until it became muscle memory. The doctrine had shifted from tank versus tank duels to combined arms warfare where tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support worked as an integrated system. Radio technology had improved as well. The SCR-528 radio set in the Sherman allowed reliable communication across the platoon, and American commanders had learned to use it as a tactical weapon. German tanks had radios too, but German doctrine emphasized strict command hierarchy. American doctrine emphasized initiative at every level. A Sherman tank commander could call for artillery support directly, could coordinate with infantry units, could adapt to changing situations without waiting for orders from higher command. The psychology had changed most of all. The Americans had absorbed horrific losses in the early engagements in Normandy. Entire tank battalions had been decimated in the Bocage fighting, but instead of breaking their will, the losses had forged something harder. The crews that survived weren't just lucky. They were skilled, and they knew it. They had learned to trust their training, trust their tactics, and most importantly, trust each other. The Germans, conversely, were beginning to experience something they had unfelt since the early days of the Eastern Front: doubt. The Panthers and Tigers were magnificent machines, engineering marvels that represented the peak of German tank design. But machines needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained crews, and by July 1944, all of those were in increasingly short supply. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of Shermans. Lose 5 in an engagement, 10 more would arrive the next day. The strategic implications were profound. German defensive doctrine in Normandy had relied on the assumption that their superior armor would allow them to inflict unsustainable casualties on Allied tank formations. If a single Panther could reliably destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, the mathematics of attrition favored the defender. But if American crews could coordinate to destroy German tanks quickly and efficiently, the equation collapsed. In the weeks following the engagement, American tank units across the Normandy front reported similar results. Ambushes that should have been devastating became costly failures. German tanks that tried to fight from static positions were flanked and destroyed. The Germans adapted by becoming even more cautious, which meant ceding initiative to the Americans, which meant the breakout became possible. The engagement that began with Henderson's damaged Sherman had been a microcosm of the entire campaign. The Germans had prepared the perfect ambush, had executed it flawlessly, and had still lost. Not because their tanks were inferior, they weren't. Not because their tactics were wrong, they were sound. They lost because they had misunderstood their enemy. The German high command had assumed that American tank crews were adequate soldiers driving inferior machines, that American numerical superiority was their only real advantage, that courage and determination couldn't overcome technical deficiencies. They were wrong on all counts. American tank crews in the summer of 1944 weren't just adequate, many had become exceptional. The machines were indeed inferior in some specifications, but the Americans had learned to fight within those limitations and to exploit the Sherman's real advantages: reliability, ease of repair, and speed. And as for courage and determination, the Americans had discovered something the Germans should have known from their own history. A well-trained crew in an inferior tank will beat a poorly coordinated crew in a superior one almost every time. The 19 seconds that separated Henderson's call for help from the destruction of the first Panther represented countless hours of training, endless after-action reviews, technical improvements in radio equipment, doctrinal evolution, and the bloody education of crews who learned by watching their friends die. Those 19 seconds were the culmination of everything the American armored forces had learned since landing in North Africa in 1942. For the individual crews involved, the engagement was both routine and extraordinary. Routine because by July 1944, most veteran Sherman crews had been in similar situations multiple times. Extraordinary because they had survived and won when doctrine said they should have been destroyed. Henderson would receive a Bronze Star for his composure under fire. Torres and Kowalski would be recommended for Silver Stars for their flanking maneuver. Broussard's shot that destroyed the first Panther would be discussed in training schools for the rest of the war as an example of perfect target acquisition. But the real impact was strategic. The German defenders in Normandy had counted on their armor to stem the Allied advance, to impose such heavy casualties that the breakout would stall. Instead, by late July, American and British armored divisions were punching through German defensive lines with increasing frequency. The Bocage, which should have been an impregnable fortress, became a death trap for German tanks that couldn't maneuver and couldn't retreat fast enough. Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout operation that began on July 25, succeeded in part because German armored reserves had been bled white in exactly the kind of engagement that destroyed those 2 Panthers. The Germans could no longer count on their technical superiority to balance the Allied material advantage. The Panthers and Tigers were still formidable, still dangerous, but they were no longer invincible, and their crews knew it. By August, the German army in Normandy was in full retreat, harried by Allied armor that now hunted with confidence. The Sherman crews that had learned their deadly trade in the hedgerows pursued the Germans across France, through Belgium, and eventually into Germany itself. The tanks they drove were still vulnerable, still prone to burning when hit, still outgunned by the best German armor. But the crews had become something the Germans had anticipated. Professionals who understood that war is not won by the best equipment, but by the best coordination, the best training, and the willingness to adapt. The psychological impact on German tankers was measurable. Post-war interviews revealed a consistent pattern. German tank commanders who had been confident in June 1944 were anxious by August, not because their tanks had gotten worse, but because their enemy had gotten better. The Americans learned, adapted, and improved with a speed that German doctrine couldn't match. In the end, the story of those 19 seconds isn't really about tanks at all. It's about the difference between an army that relied on technical superiority to overcome tactical deficiencies and an army that used tactical superiority to overcome technical limitations. It's about the German assumption that American crews would panic under fire, an assumption born of early success and maintained by institutional arrogance. Most of all, it's about what happens when training, coordination, and determination prove more valuable than armor thickness and gun caliber. The hedgerows of Normandy swallowed thousands of tanks that summer, American and German alike. But the pattern that emerged from those narrow lanes and ancient stone walls would define armored warfare for the next 80 years. The best tank isn't always the one with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It's the one crewed by soldiers who know how to fight as a team, who can adapt under fire, and who refuse to panic when the first shot comes screaming through the morning fog. Henderson's damaged Sherman was eventually recovered, repaired, and returned to service. It would fight through France, across the Rhine, and into Germany itself before the war ended. Torres and his crew would survive the war. Though Kowalski would lose 2 fingers to shrapnel in the Battle of the Bulge, Broussard would make another 43 confirmed kills before VE Day, earning a reputation as one of the finest gunners in the Third Army. The 2 Panthers they destroyed in those 19 seconds were among the last tanks Germany could afford to lose. The crews that bailed out of the 2nd Panther would be reassigned to Volksgrenadier units. Infantry formations scraped together from training units and service personnel because Germany had run out of tanks and trained tankers to crew them. Those 19 seconds in a forgotten hedgerow in Normandy didn't change the outcome of the war that was already decided by the time Henderson's Sherman took its first hit, but they revealed a truth that the Germans had been slow to recognize. The Americans had stopped being the amateurs who landed in North Africa in 1942. They had become something much more dangerous. They had become professionals. And professionals don't panic.